This morning I'm going to be talking about the lotus and psychic energy. And I'll start this morning just talking briefly about psychic energy. And then I'll get into the lotus and psychic energy. Also, I've handed out locally here a diagram of well, it's not really the lotus. The focus of the diagram is what's called spirali. And I'll be talking about the spirali related to permanent atoms this morning. And I wanted you to have a visual. It will also be up on the computer screen and later on the YouTube video, the same diagram. The diagram is almost 100% accurate, but there's some subtleties that aren't, which are irrelevant actually to what I'm talking about. It's just to get the visual image of what a spirali is in relationship to our permanent atoms. So, having said that, say what? The past 2 Sundays I've talked about various aspects of the lotus, building the lotus, the permanent atoms in relationship to the petals of the lotus, and I've talked also about the chalice. This morning I'm going to be concluding these talks on the lotus, and I'll be talking about psychic energy in relationship to the petals of the lotus, which correspond to permanent atoms. I was thinking, last night about the talk, and I thought, I wish I knew how to create a hologram so that you all could see it, kind of suspended in air, and you'd have a 3D perspective of what a permanent atom is and what the spirali is and what the lotus is and the chalice is. And these things are possible, and I know as our consciousness advances and the spirali of our permanent atoms become more activated, in time we will be able to do this. And the reason I know that we're going to be able to do this is because I have already seen it done. We first read about it in the Alice Bailey teachings about how she initially received the transmission of the Tibetan's teaching. And then I had my first hands-on experience with my own teacher. The first time I ever had a meeting with him, a very intense meeting, as he was talking to me, this what I later learned was a hologram came up, and here he's telling me these profundities, and over here I'm seeing these images in the air, which we would call a hologram, about what he's talking about. And it's like, oh my God, what am I supposed to say? Who am I supposed to pay attention to? And so I just kept going back and forth, and he just sat there and smiled. I know he was playing a game with me. But anyway, so that was my first hands-on experience, of how a person can project an idea in the air, which we would call a hologram. So I know in time, we'll be able to do it ourselves. So there you go. So without having the advantage of a hologram this morning, you just have to use your creative imagination and kind of image what this whole process is about. So first, psychic energy. Psychic energy forms the very cornerstone of Agni Yoga. So for esoteric students who are still struggling with trying to define Agni Yoga, this would be one of the definitions. The psychic energy, which is the cornerstone of Agni Yoga. And then we have to understand what psychic energy is. So Agni Yoga explains that psychic energy is a primary energy. It is the primary energy. And that all other energies are just variations of that primary or psychic energy. And you can learn about these variations if you study and read and think about what's written in the books of Agni Yoga. Here is one clue about a variation of this primary energy. It's called prana. So psychic energy manifests as a life force which is called prana. So whether we understand this or know it, it's still there. Prana is there. We breathe it in, we breathe it out. Without prana, there is no life, because prana is life energy. When thinking about Agni Yoga, a person may ask, how do I begin Agni Yoga? For example, White Mountains sponsors a Facebook page called Agni Yoga-Living Ethics Community of Living Ethics. And before you can subscribe and get onto that Facebook, there are questions that you have to answer. This is not one of the questions, but I think I might add it. I'll ask them, do you practice Agni Yoga? What's your favorite sutra in Agni Yoga? Things like that. Sometimes people answer, sometimes people don't. If they don't, then I go to their own Facebook page and see what their interests are, and if their interests are related to the teaching, to hierarchy, just to the beauty and the value of life, then we let them come on to and subscribe to this Facebook page. So here's the answer. If someone like yourself or another says, how can I begin Agni Yoga? The Master M says, primarily, you must realize the presence of psychic energy. You must realize the presence of psychic energy. So what is the Master saying? He is saying that we must be a vessel of psychic energy. We must be a vessel of psychic energy to be able to recognize its presence. We must be sensitive to this sometimes subtle and sometimes powerful influence of psychic energy. So he's telling us, sometimes, in order to recognize the presence of psychic energy, we're going to have to be incredibly sensitive, because sometimes this energy is very subtle. Other times it's very powerful, and in its power we have to know how to control it, how to use it creatively so that it doesn't work against us. Psychic energy renders a great service to humanity, but only if it is handled rightly and is used for noble purposes. It seems very odd when you don't really know the power of psychic energy. It seems odd to think that odd to me anyway, that anybody would use psychic energy in a destructive way. But there's always, the left and the right, the dark and the light, with almost everything, as above, so below as well. So we can, if we understand that premise, then we'll understand that psychic energy can be used, for the positive, for creative efforts, or it can be used for destructive means. But it is abundant in the whole of the universe. So I think that's important to know, that it's abundant in the whole of the universe, especially when Master M talks about psychic energy and we understand that psychic energy is the cornerstone of Agni Yoga. Then to me, it brings Agni Yoga to the forefront of life. It's not just something that we practice on the weekends. But even without knowing anything about Agni Yoga, it's part of everybody's life. So it is abundant. Psychic energy is abundant in the whole of cosmos. Like an ocean, its resources are unlimited. But, and this is always, the catch-22 with the teachings is that we must know how to fill our nature with that energy and then use it in the right ways. And so that's what Agni Yoga elaborates on. That's what the teaching and teachers elaborate. How do you fill your nature with psychic energy? And once you fill your nature with psychic energy, then how do you use it in the right ways? So I'll be talking a little bit about that as well this morning. So the inexhaustible source of energy is open to all of us, to you, to me, if we use the right condition in order to channel it in the right direction. So there's a little clue in that we must have the right environment, that we live in the right environment to draw this psychic energy into ourselves and to use it creatively in the right ways. Agni Yoga tells us that psychic energy as a whole does not belong to any one person, but it is in the very air that we breathe, and that's why we call it prana. That psychic energy is in the very air that we breathe, and this air can be used to keep our body in good shape. Imagine that. And I'm going to explain how that is done again a little later. Whereas psychic energy is universal, still we must use it in the right way. We must use it in all of our actions. This is very, I have a lot of words to share this morning, and so I want to slow down in how I'm speaking and maybe do some repetitive, sharing of what I've already talked about so that we can really get it and absorb it. If not, if you're tired this morning and can't concentrate, then you can listen to the YouTube later on, at the end of today. So, the energy is universal. We must use it in the right way in all of our actions, on all levels, and in harmony for the common good of humanity. Those people who are charged with psychic energy will live a long life in spite of conditions. They will live a long life in spite of conditions. So, for example, you can be living in the most unsanitary or contaminated conditions where you may have been, or even today, find yourself under the attack of dark forces due to your enlightenment, due to your illumined heart, due to your striving, due to your sacrificial service. But because your psychic energy is abundant, even in such wretched and dark conditions, those conditions will not affect you, and you will live a long and sacrificial life. It just popped into my head, this story that Torgrim Saradarian shared with me one day. He was talking about the fact that he and his wife, Joanne, they were driving in the car in Sedona, and they were pulling into this 7-Eleven store, and all of a sudden another car came barreling out of nowhere, and they were going to have a head-on collision. And he was able to avert that collision. So he was telling me how it happened, and I said, well, did you have your seatbelt on? And he said, no. He said, but don't you do that. Since I tended to be very obedient to him. And he told us many stories where, when he was in the service and when he was engaged in a death-defying situation where most people would have lost their life in that moment. But he didn't. He lived to a ripe old age. And so I couldn't help but think about all of those stories, when thinking about psychic energy, and when it says that living in the most unsanitary or contaminated conditions, you can still live a long and sacrificial life. And so those are just some examples. So I'm not going to spend the whole hour talking about psychic energy, but I wanted to briefly mention it, and the fact that there can be a lack of psychic energy as well. A lack of psychic energy creates, this is if you are, as an individual or a group or a nation, is lacking in psychic energy. What happens, it creates various kinds of doubts in you and for others. For example, you may have doubts about the existence of your soul, and many people do. When people have such a doubt, they are lacking psychic energy. They may have doubts about immortality. They may have doubts about the potential in them that is waiting to manifest. And they may think, this is it. This is as good as my life is ever going to be. Such thinking means that person has a lack of psychic energy, because a lack of psychic energy creates doubt. And also a doubt about benevolent forces. Well, those in the teaching, in the esoteric teaching, especially those of us that are aligned with the teachings of Torquem Saradarian, who is very much part of the hierarchical teachings called the Ageless Wisdom. We know about hierarchy. We know about higher ashrams. We know about the guiding hand. But we don't necessarily call them benevolent forces. We just understand them to be, benevolent forces. But you don't have to be on this specific path to believe in benevolent forces. But to believe in benevolent forces means that you have enough psychic energy that doubt hasn't creeped in like a worm into your behavior and thinking. There are benevolent forces out there. About the possibility, we must have enough psychic energy to know about the possibility of higher guidance and higher protection. Protection by the Master, protection of the Christ, and protection of ashramic energy. Such kinds of doubts prepare the grave for such doubtful people. That's a pretty strong statement to make. But you can see it. You can see it in people who are, clinically depressed. We all get depressed from time to time. It's natural to have occasional depression. But for people who have clinical depression, they are lacking psychic energy. So if you're a therapist, you're going to find out ways to help them increase their psychic energy. And essentially, what you're going to do is teach them how to love. Unconditional love. Nothing good can come from a person who is full of doubt. You cannot even build any kind of a permanent friendship because of your doubt. Why? You're going to doubt, no, that person doesn't love me. And I've had this experience where a family member married into the family and needed a lot of support because she had a lot of self-doubt, and I would tell her over and over and over again, I love you so much, I love you so much, you're so beautiful. And she could not accept it. She said, I know you're lying to me. See, that is a person that's lacking psychic energy, that primary energy, which is life itself. So mutual love increases psychic energy. So if you're trying to ask yourself, this real basic, simple question and need a basic, simple answer, that's it. It's mutual love. No one can increase and benefit by psychic energy without having pure love in their heart. The energy we receive from psychic energy lasts forever and increases. It can last forever, and this is important, it's an important and, it increases if we have pure love in our heart. Love allows psychic energy to radiate, to heal, to uplift, and to transform people. Okay, so now let me talk about the lotus and psychic energy. Psychic energy is a combination of two kinds of energy. So now I'm getting into the more subtle, more esoteric, more abstract, aka invisible, sides of and understanding of psychic energy. So now you want to shift into intuitional thinking and let your creative imagination create images, in your mind as I'm talking. So psychic energy is a combination of two kinds of energy. One is energy that comes from the Great Bear, and that energy coming from the Great Bear is then transmitted to the core of our lotus. The core of our lotus is called the seat of self-consciousness. The seat of self-consciousness. The second kind of energy is the energy of the Pleiades. And the energy of the Pleiades fuses with the energy of the Great Bear. The energy of the Pleiades fuses with the energy of the Great Bear and is then transmitted to us through our higher self, through the lotus. But in reality, psychic energy also comes from the spiritual triad, also called the Holy Triad, the monad, the Christ, and from hierarchy. Once our higher self receives the energy from the Great Bear and the Pleiades, it then radiates that psychic energy into the core of our lotus. And it does so through this holy triad, through this spiritual triad. This radiation of psychic energy, what does it do? Initially, what does it do? I mean, it's one thing to know that it is there. It's another thing to know, its purpose and how it's going to function. So one of the first functions of the fusion of this psychic energy coming from the Great Bear and the Pleiades is that it increases the principles of light and love and willpower. Light and love and willpower. It increases these three principles and puts them into our life. So our light increases, our love increases, our spiritual willpower increases as more of that psychic energy, comes into the spiritual triad and into the core of our lotus. And I'll tell you how that's done in just a minute. As the light and love and willpower increases in our life, then you become a disperser of psychic energy. What does psychic energy do? What can it do? It can heal our bodies, our physical body, our emotional body, our mental body. It can enlighten. Psychic energy will enlighten our mind, and it will expand our consciousness. if you're making notes, underline expansion of consciousness. It's very important in relationship to the spirali of the permanent atoms, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, okay? I know, I will get to it. Psychic energy has another term, which is Holy Spirit. So psychic energy is the Holy Spirit aspect in the universe. You see how I'm trying to take, these words, create like a mosaic or a map so that everything is linking together. This energy is received and accumulated in our lotus. And our chalice holds this energy. It also accumulates in higher centers and then is used for spiritual ends. So psychic energy, essentially for us to understand, emanates as an individual, emanates from the core of our lotus, from the jewel and the petals in our lotus. It then passes through, and this is important because it can't just pile up in the lotus and stay there. Energy doesn't act that way. It's that energy has to be transmitted. Where is the transmission of this energy? Where is it going to go? Where is it going to flow? It's going to flow into our physical, etheric, astral, and mental bodies. And the way it does this, the way it manifests through these bodies, is through the centers in the bodies, the major and the minor centers in our bodies. And here we go, it also passes through the spirali of the permanent atoms. So there's a lot going on, right? That's visible and invisible. So the spirali of the permanent atoms are related to our 7 centers. The spirali are also related to the 7 rays and also to the 7 sacred planets. So all of the relationship of the permanent atoms and the spirali then become spirals of communication. So you might want to put that picture up on the video now just for a few minutes or a minute, and then you can take it down and we'll put it up again more toward the end of the talk. As the psychic energy passes through these centers of our physical, etheric, astral, and mental bodies, it begins to, as the psychic energy passes through these centers, it begins to unfold the corresponding petals in the lotus. So if you haven't listened to the past 2 Sunday talks, I encourage you, if you're interested, to go to White Mountain's account, the WMEA YouTube account, and listen to these 2 and watch these 2 videos, because it will show you and talk to you about these petals, right, in the lotus. The centers that I'm talking about are the head center, the throat center, and the heart center, which are the higher centers, in our nature. And they're always found on the 3 subplanes of each sphere of consciousness. The 3 top subplanes, the first, second, and third subplane from the top down. That's where these 3 centers, the 3 major centers, are always found. Also, this includes the centers on the 4th subplane of each plane of consciousness. So that's the more scientific, but for those of us that want to know the more specifics, this is it from the teaching. So, for example, as the love petals of the lotus unfold, what's happening is that a pressure is created on the petals of the heart center in your head. There's so much I would like to share with this. So you could ask, like, well, what kind of pressure? And what does it mean? What does it do? It increases your sensitivity. This pressure increases your sensitivity. And it also confirms or affirms for you that the love petals in the lotus are starting to unfold. And then there's these spirali begin to communicate with your sensitivities. As the psychic senses begin to increase and refine themselves, then you become what? More psychic. Not, a medium, not at all. It's like you become more globally aware of what's going on in the world, what's going on with humanity, the process of evolution. You begin to understand and recognize what the future of humanity is going to be. All from the beginning, as this pressure starts with the unfolding, not just the love petals, but the knowledge petals and the sacrificial petals, but specifically the love petals, because of the heart center in the head. And there's like a rippling effect when this pressure takes place in your head. There's a lot of correspondences that take place with your glands and organs and different levels of consciousness that we all have access to. So the love petals particularly relate us to humanity. As the love petals unfold, we begin to feel at one with humanity. So if you're on my Facebook page, you'll see I posted a meme there with the individual heart becoming part of the one heart of humanity. That was the lead-in to this morning's talk, which of course majority will not have any clue about that, but that are on that Facebook page, but you are. So the love petals, as they unfold, we begin to feel at one with humanity and share its joys. We also share its sorrows. And in the meantime, we turn into a stream of love that pours into the chalice of humanity. So this tells us that not only do we, as an individual, have a chalice, but humanity also has a chalice. The petals of the heart center relate us to a group. And when we are part of a group, then we're going to react to the group's happiness and unhappiness. This is a sign where you can tell if a person is connected to the lotus of the group. If they are part of the happiness and unhappiness of the group, they're going to be connected to the lotus of the group. Just like a person has a lotus in the mental sphere, likewise, a group too will have a lotus in the higher mind of the group. If a member's mental sphere becomes the same frequency of the mental sphere of the group, their petals of the heart center will relate the person to their group, where they will have a deep psychic sensitivity to all that occurs within the group life. Essentially, this is called the law of resonance. It's like when you're tuning a piano or you're tuning a musical instrument, if it is tuned to the key note of that string or that musical instrument, there is a most pure vibration or resonance. It's like with a violin, all professional violinists dream of having an Amati violin or a Stradivarius. Why? Because the wood is so perfected And the maker of that violin was such a genius that all you have to do is pick it up and play a note and you're a genius violinist, because the resonance of that violin is so perfect, so beautiful. So that would be the example of Christ, of the masters, of hierarchy, of senior disciples and initiates, as their instrument is so resonant to the core of life, to the primary energy of life, to the prana of life, that they radiate that purity, that frequency, that sound to humanity. So if the mental sphere, that higher mind of the member of the group is of the same frequency of the mental sphere of the group, the petals of their heart center are going to relate themselves to the group. And that means they're going to have a deep psychic sensitivity. Whether they're local or international, they're still going to have a very deep sensitivity or a telepathy. Imagine that, a telepathy that occurs within the group life. And this is called the ashramic life. As the psychic energy activates the petals of sacrifice, so we've talked about the petals of love, this is the petals of sacrifice. The sacrificial petals allow us to enter the path of true leadership. Fareed Zakaria this morning featured leadership on his program. It hopefully recorded, if not, I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere on the internet. I'm running out of time, so I can't get into it, but it's a beautiful program. And he featured some really incredible leaders. So you can see the effects of and the manifestation of the creativity of true leaders, particularly in this country, because that's where the focus was. So the sacrificial petals allow us to enter the path of true leadership, a leadership which will bring humanity under the influence of the tower, the will of Shambhala. As the sacrifice petals unfold in us, they begin to exercise pressure on the petals at the center, at the base of the spine, which then releases what we call the central fire, or Kundalini energy. And that Kundalini energy begins to climb up the spine and activates the glands and the organs and the centers that I was just talking about. When this process begins, and as the bud petals of the lotus unfolds, the petals of the head center opens and draws the energy of fire from the base of the spine and fuses with it. Now look, when we say this, as above, so below, when I started out, I talked about how the Great Bear and the Pleiades fuse and then transmit that energy into our lotus, into the spiritual triad, and then into the lotus. Now we're bringing the psychic energy from great ones into our chalice, and the base of our spine is responding and coming together to meet it. Fusion. Thus, each new flow of psychic energy expands your consciousness. Your consciousness is conditioned by the flow of psychic energy and by the degree of unfoldment of the petals of the centers. There are some interferences to the flow of psychic energy. Great ones can occasionally insulate themselves from pollution. And to regenerate themselves, they go through a special diet, through meditation, and also through seclusion. So if they're the great ones, or even us as little ones, if we see that our psychic energy is becoming depleted, this is what we can do. We go through a special diet. we engage ourselves in spatial meditation and put ourselves as much into seclusion as possible. Today, the task of the New Age disciple is more difficult. We must raise our consciousness higher and higher to create a shield that will insulate us from the pollutions that are out there and to keep alive the circulation of psychic energy within our system. So more is required from us than 400 or 500 years ago. What stops the flow of psychic energy is negative emotions, separative or distorted thoughts. This is why teachers suggest a regulated diet, elevated emotions, and pure thought to keep this psychic energy in circulation. Prayer, meditation, elevated emotions. This is very interesting. Prayer, meditation, elevated emotions create a chemistry, a combined chemistry of all three of those actions that then allow us to conduct and to contact psychic energy more readily. Prayer, meditation, and elevated emotions. Do you want to put that diagram up again? As the psychic energy stimulates the spirali begins to function one after another, and the human soul proceeds on the path of greater communication with the universe and on the path of greater creativity and service. Now, this is what's going on with the spirali, and this is so esoteric. Again, just listen intuitively. But you can look at the diagram to get an idea that the diagram is showing the mental body, the astral body, and the physical body and its subplanes. Every plane of consciousness has 7 subplanes. So there has to be a way to get that psychic energy from the permanent atoms to communicate with the rest of the human mechanism. So every permanent atom has 7 spirali, and the mental unit has 4. Now, if you've really spent a lot of time, like I have, studying the spirali, you know that there are really 10 spirali in, specifically there's 10. The 7 are considered the minor spirali. But even in the teachings, you're going to learn not about the 10, but the 7, and that 4 of those spirali are the most active. Now the question is, what do you mean most active? And if these 4 spirali of the permanent atoms are active, what does it mean? Well, it means that now that psychic energy is coming from the core of the lotus and now changing who we are, transforming, sublimating, transforming our entire nature. Our whole cellular structure is undergoing change. And the reason for this change, it puts us in communication with greater stations of life. Eventually, ultimately puts us in communication with the heart of the universe. That's when those 3 major spirali become active. But the reason for 7 is that each spirali will communicate with one subplane of each plane of consciousness. So let's say, I don't have time to let's say. Okay, So, but you just go to the books like I have, and you study it and study it and study it, and then you begin to experience the effects of what's going on with this psychic energy that's taking place within your whole mechanism, from the Kundalini energy to the unfolding process of the petals of the lotus, and then it all starts coming together. So now it's not a hypothesis, it's a reality. So as let me repeat this. So the psychic activation of the spirali is very important, because the spirali provides health and purity to its corresponding vehicles, astral, physical, etheric, or the mental. It's very important to provide health and purity to the corresponding vehicles, and releases the energy of the cells and atoms of the vehicles, tuning them to the jewel in the lotus. And that means this, oh gosh, there's so much to share. I mean, it's so incredible that this soul is now blooming into its own existence, getting ready to let go of and destroy the causal body, letting go of the solar angel and destroying the causal body. And that's the reason we must have initiations. Take initiations of consciousness, and this is why the dark forces are coming after you. You know, as an individual or as a group, they're trying to keep you, preventing you from taking these initiations, which prevent evolution from occurring. So the physical body will become charged with psychic energy and is able to live a long and healthy life. Oh, I'm not going to finish. Okay, let me wrap up with, I'm almost done. There's not too much left here. And my notes. There is a corresponding relationship of the petals to the hierarchy. It's another point to keep in mind, that there is a definite relationship between the petals of the lotus and hierarchy, which tells us that through the lotus, it is through the lotus that we gain communication with the masters, and this is where the spirali comes in. These are lines of communication. They're invisible, but they're powerful, powerful. Whether they're invisible or not, to psychics they're not invisible. A psychic, a true pure psychic, will recognize these lines of communication, what's called spirali, and recognize if this person that says, I'm in contact with hierarchy, they're going to be able to tell. It also helps us to gain communication with the masters. As the petals unfold, we will receive impressions from the hierarchy and be able to regulate our life with the plan and direction of hierarchy. And I think I'm just going to end right there. It's a lot. Is it too much? Well, if it's too much, then just, you can order the DVD, you can order the CD, you can go to the YouTube later on toward the end of today and listen and listen and listen, and then you can go to the books and say, I'm really interested. I started studying about permanent atoms and the lotus in 1978. That's how long I've been studying this information, learning and learning and learning. It's just, it's a passion.